And now let's look at the introduction to Matthew, right? Matthew, the authorship of Matthew, the first gospel. Like its counterparts, it is an anonymous document. You know, anonymous means what? No name, right? No name. The evidence from the church fathers is that it was known from the outset of the post-apostolic era and was unanimously recognized as authoritative. So let's look at the authorship. So the earliest, see, if you read the Gospel of Matthew, you won't see anywhere saying it is written by Matthew. You don't read, right? So how do you know that it's written by Matthew? The earliest witness to the authorship comes from superscription. Comes from a superscription, a title, kata Mattheon, means according to Matthew. And superscription is not given by God, right? Superscription is not inspired. You not only in Matthew, you read Psalm, a lot of superscriptions later added, right? So, how do we know that this is written by Matthew? All right. So, when we read, general consensus is that superscription was added early in the transmission of the text to identify its author, to distinguish from others. All right. So, to distinguish one manuscript from other, they added. So, most here is okay. Since half of these men are not of apostles, there's a confirmation of the view that in the church for a considerable time period prior to AD 125, and perhaps as early as the time of their individual publications, right, these very persons were associated with the Gospels as its authors. So there was confusions in the beginning who wrote, right? And interestingly, Papias, here we are going to learn some names. He's called as an apostolic father. The apostolic fathers, the reason why we call them like that, because they lived in a time when there was apostles, and therefore their testimonies were very important. So Eusebius talk about Papias. Papias lived from 70 AD to 150. Papias says, Matthew composed his gospel in Aramaic. So this is the first testimony that who wrote Matthew. His view was Matthew wrote, but it is in Aramaic and later interpreted in Greek. All right. So you have, and there are, in the early church, there are people who even believed that it was written in Hebrew. Well, maybe there could be some reason for them to think that way, but that's not the way modern scholarship believes. But Papias is the first one who credited this gospel to Matthew. Then you have Irenaeus, church father, AD 185, wrote, Matthew produced his gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. That's how he says. And Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome, Pontic Church. That's what Irenaeus was saying. So Irenaeus wants to say, Matthew worked among Hebrews and produced a gospel for Hebrews, for Jewish people. Whereas Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome. Then you have Origen, AD 185 to 54. He said, among the four gospels, which are the only disputable ones in the church of God throughout the world, I have learned by tradition that the first was written by Matthew, who once a publican, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, and it was prepared for the converts from Judaism, published in Hebrew language. So again, these fathers were saying this was prepared for Jewish converts, published in Hebrew language. That's what they are saying. And then Eusebius in AD 325, he's the, Eusebius is a famous person because he wrote the history of church, the beginning period of Israel church. So he would say, all of the disciples of our Lord, only Matthew and John have left us written memorials. And the tradition says were led to write only under the pressure of necessity. For Matthew, who had first to preach to Hebrews when he was about to go to other people. And then he committed his gospel to writing in his native tongue. So interesting, all of this would argue for Matthew, but they always say Matthew wrote in native tongue. That means most probably either Aramaic or Hebrew. But what is our discussion? Who wrote Matthew, right? So all the early fathers claim and suggest that, okay, it is written by Matthew. So concerning the authorship, it was not a big debate, but concerning the language, it was a big debate. Now let's look at some internal evidences. Is there anything that we can observe if you read closely? Number one, in the four list of the 12 disciples, right? Four lists were given. Only the first gospel, Matthew, is called as what? Publican. Only Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, you read, Matthew is called as what? Publican. Some suggested this was conscious, personal touch by the writer to acknowledge God's grace in his life in saving him. He wants to say, this man that Matthew, that I am, was a publican, which means someone who was hated by Jewish people. Now, second, Matthew 9 verse 9, the author records Jesus calling a man named Matthew, right? Interesting observation. Please look at. In Matthew, we read Jesus calling someone as Matthew. In Mark 2 verse 14 and Luke 5, 27 to 28, same incident is said, but the evangelists relate a similar call in almost identical language of a man called Levi. Right? Mark and Luke would use the name Levi. But only in Matthew, what name is used? Matthew is used. Since neither Mark nor Luke mention a call of one named Matthew, and since all the list of the disciples, only the name Matthew is used, it is concluded that Levi and Matthew are the same person. Right? So we know that it is concluded because there is no other disciples, and therefore it is the one and the same. Furthermore, Mark and Luke, it can be concluded that his original name was Levi. Original name was Levi. And he either took the name Matthew, which means gift of God, himself, or maybe it had been given to him by the Lord. So Matthew was not his original name. Levi was his original name. Probably either he took the name or the Lord gave him. In either case, the fact that only the author of the first gospel refers to the one called as Matthew can be understood as a further indication of author's self-identification. Because he wants to portray who he is now. Maybe he's not a Levi, he's now a Matthew. Another observation. following his call, what happened? Following, call of Matthew, the disciples made a feast for the Lord in his own house. All right, so what Matthew did, he made the feast for the Lord. This is what we read. Both Mark and Luke refer to the house as his house. Okay, somebody else. But whereas Matthew omits the personal pronoun and he simply says the house, because he doesn't want to say his house because this is his own house. So he would say the house. Now, all of the synoptics relate dispute or paying tribute to Caesar, right? All the synoptics, that means synoptics means what? 3 gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's the synoptics. Always, when we use this term, please keep in your mind. Synoptic means Matthew, Mark, and Luke. 3 gospel looking together, right? All of the synoptic relate dispute or paying tribute to Caesar. So here is a verse. Only Matthew's gospel uses a technical term for tribute, right? Actually, nomisma, that is a technical term. Whereas Mark and Luke use the more common expression, denarian. That is a very common, but Matthew is using a technical term there because he was a tax collector. He knew the right word to use, maybe. So furthermore, only Matthew's gospel records Peter's being questioned by the collectors of annual half-shekel temple tax. Only Matthew's gospel records as to whether Jesus had paid the tax. Still further, only Matthew records large figures involved in the story of unforgiving debtor. So which is, there are a lot of this personal touch has been given in his gospel to tell that, yes, this is written by this tax collector, this publican tax collector. The gospel is written by the tax collector who is an apostle, which is none other than Matthew himself, who was a Levi, right? Who was known as a Levi. Now, all right, there are some objections to this authorship. If you wanted to have more information on that one, you can just go to the notes detail. I'm not going to explain much here. I basically consider this was written by Matthew, but if you think that you need more information, this can be, it is given there, and the answer to the Matthean gospel. All right. So let me conclude here. The objection to apostolic authorships that I already discussed have failed to dislodge a clear testimony of the early church, right? The external evidence overwhelmingly supports Matthean authorship, and the internal evidence, without exception, consistent with that position, right? Okay, so that's about the authorship that we need to know. Okay, who wrote the Gospel of Matthew? That is later known as the Gospel of Matthew. In the beginning, there was no information. Only you saw there is a superscription, not within the Bible, within the Gospel, any clear-cut evidences like in other epistles and other places about the authorship. Now the question is recipients. That is a question. That's the big one. To whom he wrote it, right? According to the clear testimony from church history, Matthew wrote his gospel with the Jews, and particularly Palestinian Jews in mind, because Jews were many places. So Matthew wrote his gospel particularly with Palestinian Jews in mind. The internal evidence is consistent with this testimony. Both its Jewish tone and Jewish perspective distinguish Matthew's gospel as especially suited for a Jewish readership, right? Conclusion stands even if it is assumed that the Matthew gospel was written in Greek. Greek was the common language of the Mediterranean world of the first century. And it would have been the common language of Jewish diaspora. What is diaspora? Jewish people who were scattered. All right. And even the Palestinian Jews were trilingual. That they knew Hebrew, they knew Aramaic, they knew Greek. They were trilingual, according to archaeology. So it may be concluded that Matthew wrote in the language that would give his gospel the widest possible exposure, which is in Greek. The fact that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah promised of God and prophesied in the Old have relevance not only for Palestinian Jews, but also for the Jews everywhere and for Gentiles as well. Because Matthew really talks about Gentiles in this gospel. Now, another question is from where it was written, the place of writing. Two locations were championed. Number one, it was written Palestine. The other one, it was written from Antioch. All right. So the Palestinian written from Palestine is what most of the people believe. For example, we already saw Irenaeus stated that he wrote a gospel among the Hebrews while Peter and Paul were laboring in Rome. Right? And taken at the face value, contrast indicated between Rome and as the place where Peter and Paul were working, and the expression among the Hebrews as the location of Matthew's ministry would point to a Palestinian origin for Matthew. All right. Now, the argument against Palestine and in favor of Antioch are several fold. The other group argues against it. Some have found it difficult to explain why Matthew would have written his gospel in Greek, assuming the Greek gospel was the original. If he were living and ministering among Palestinian Jews when he wrote it, then why should he write in Greek? Native language in Palestine at that time was Aramaic. The very fact that the gospel was written in Greek has led several scholars to postulate a location for its author in the diaspora, and especially at Antioch, where there was a large population of Greek-speaking Jews. Large population. All right? And now, there's one more thing that we need to look at here. Additional support for this kind of location comes from the number of Aramaic words used in Matthew. Can anyone say, let me ask you a question. Can anyone say an Aramaic word used in the Gospel of Matthew?
Lama sabachthani.
All right. Okay? Anything else? What is 5 verse 22?
Raka. Raka.
Okay. Can you read that verse?
But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother Raka is answerable to the Sanhedrin, but anyone who says you fool will be in danger of the fire of hell.
Okay, 6 verse 24. Can we read that also?
No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money.
Okay, maybe some other way you say mammon.
Mammon, yeah.
Mammon, something like that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you see some Aramaic terms are used there. And the thought is that where the readers are Aramaic speaking Jews, there would not have been no need for the author to explain these words. For example, our focus is 27:33, where Jesus saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. And the translation of that Aramaic word was given right there. What was that? My God, why have you forsaken me? So the argument would be, what is the need to explain it, the meaning, right? So it looks like these people do not know Aramaic. Finally, many of these same scholars see Matthew's interest in Gentiles and in his favorable attitude toward Gentile mission corroborating evidence, especially to support that this is written from Antioch, not from Palestine. These argue, according to Acts, Antioch was not only a key Christian center for dispersed Jews, but also the point of departure for Gentile ministries in the early church. They all went from Antioch to the Gentiles. Now, what is our conclusion? We have no conclusion at all here. While Syrian province is certainly possible, arguments are inconclusive. The evidence is insufficient to identify the location of the author with any kind of precision. All right, some people say it is written from Syria. Right, so there is no precise time. Now the date when it is written. We looked at all the other things. It's not a big thing. But for the sake of discussion, let's look at it. Is assumed that the Matthew is the author, and the date for the writing of the Greek gospel, the gospel referred to by the early church, is the gospel and not some precursor. Leaving the synoptic question open for the moment, let's suggest date from early 4th to mid 6th AD, 40s to mid 60s, assuming. If you believe that Matthean priority, right? If you believe that Matthew has not borrowed from Mark, then it should be about 40s to mid 60s. From the standpoint of 60s to the end of the 60s, for those who hold Markan priority, what is that? Some people believe that Matthew has borrowed some material from Matthew, and so they might say it is so Matthew's gospel written later, and they would argue Mark's gospel was first written, then Matthew was written. If it is so, that is the two groups of people who would argue. The early church places writing of Mark at the midpoint of the 60s. So I am not going to spend much time. One thing is, so here the argument would be, is this one. One important historical event, right, which is not recorded in Matthew. That is the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, which is not recorded, which is to me, it is a clear indication that the Gospel of Matthew was written before AD 70. Before AD 70, all right? So that is one of the big things to note. But most of these books were written that way. Okay, maybe there are some other arguments to say, maybe Matthew 20 verse 7 about the parable of a wedding feast. Some people suggest that it is a reference to destruction of Jerusalem. I don't think that is need to say. All right, now let's look at the purpose of the gospel. Unlike the fourth gospel, right, with Gospel of John, clearly states what is the purpose. Synoptic gospel do not contain any a statement of purpose. At the same time, it is assumed that all four gospels were written with a common goal, right? And ultimately, each presents the facts concerning the person, work of Jesus Christ in order to invite faith in the gospel. and in order to establish those in the faith who have responded to the gospel. These gospels were written to invite people to believe in the gospel or to establish those who already trusted. All right. The important verse in the Gospel of Matthew would be Matthew chapter 28, verse 19 to 20. Right? What do you read? In the closing verse of this Gospel, Matthew records Jesus exhorting his followers to evangelize the lost and disciple the converts. Right? So this character of the charge and its location at every end of the gospel suggests something of programmatic nature of Great Commission. So evidently he is answering one question. That is, okay, what is this church? How this began and why it began? Evidently that is there. You cannot take your eyes from the Gospel of Matthew without looking Matthew 28, verse 19 to 20. Where Jesus is concluding, okay, why this church is, why we are what we are, right? So that is a kind of thing that he does there. So that is there. Now, but not only that, we are not only focusing on the end. Two additional considerations, however, suggest more specific identifications of Matthew's purpose. Matthew employs a number of quotations from Old Testament to show the relationship between messianic promise found there and fulfillment of that promise in Jesus of Nazareth. Right? So while, yes, Jesus is the Christ and he has a significance for all of humanity, it also has obvious and direct significance for the Jew. Yes, Christ is the Savior of the whole world, but Matthew is taking time to explain from the Old Testament. So the implication is that Matthew wrote his gospel with an eye specifically toward his Jewish compatriots. His overriding concern was to see his fellow Jews to be won to Jesus as their Messiah and grounded in the faith. So that is the one of the real burden that Matthew had. Real burden that Matthew had. And of course, there are a specific interpretation of Matthew's gospel is like was suggested by the testimony of the early church. Church fathers had been noted previously, understood that Matthew recorded his gospel specifically for the Jews, that they might be established and confirmed in the truth of the gospel. All right. So that is really, it is there. Now, having looked at the purpose, so I said, you cannot explain chapter 1 of Matthew without looking at chapter 28 of Matthew. You will be wrong. And we might be simply looking at a genealogy, but we need to have any preachers, what we need to do, we need to have whole picture all the time. Whole picture. Whole picture is important in interpreting. Remember, a book context. A book context. That is taking the first chapter, taking last chapter, how do you connect it? You need to look at, right? That connection has to be there. The danger in many places is that people deal with the Bible like people deal with Quran. Bible is not Quran. Bible is not like few independent verses written that God, as if God revealed. No, Bible has written in a context. And anyone who tries to ignore it is in the peril of communicating what God doesn't want it to communicate, which God has never intended. All right, now let's look at characteristics. 4 distinguishing characteristics of Matthew's gospel. Number 1, messianic. All right, he talks about Jesus. For example, he's taking citations from the Old Testament to tell how those verses that was there for Israel has been fulfilled in Matthew. For example, the prophecy included his birthplace, Egypt, killing of the infants in Bethlehem, residence in Nazareth, foreigner, and the place where he's going to begin his ministry, his miraculous activity, his demeanor as God's servant, parabolic nature of his teaching, offer of himself to Israel, being abandoned by his followers, his arrest, his betrayal. In all these places, he brings Old Testament verses to explain. So, in all but 2 days, Matthew uses a fulfillment formula to make it clear to his readers that Jesus was the one spoken of in these prophecies. We'll look at this one, Matthew's fulfillment formula, sometime later as we go into this book. So first of all, it is messianic characteristic. Second, it is eschatological. The word kingdom, right? Almost 56 times used in Matthew. This is not common in other gospel. And Jesus is called a son of David 9 times by Matthew, and 3 times as often in other gospels. So he wants to say Jesus is the son of David. Why? Why he's talking about the kingdom? And only in Matthew, Jerusalem is called the holy city and the city of the great king. Why? Right? So because Matthew has that Old Testament concept of eschatology, he retained in his writing. Yes, because Messiah was always connected with this kingdom for Jewish people, because their hope was that one day Messiah will come and establish a kingdom for them. Right? That's what they were thinking, and that was all the prophecies were about. All right, eschatology. Third, it was Jewish, right? It is a Jewish. Wow, okay. From a Jewish perspective, this is written. For example, he begins with a genealogy, right? And teaching his lineage to David and to Abraham. Jesus is the son of David. Jesus is the son of Abraham. And he includes more OT quotations and allusions than any other gospels. He carefully records the ongoing conflict between Jesus and Jewish leaders. And the Jewish custom of ceremonial washings is mentioned without a comment, because one of the characteristics that this is simply Jewish. So a Jewish person, when he reads, he can easily understand. But Matthew doesn't simply want to say only Jewish. It is also universal. Matthew shows us distinct interest in the Gentiles as well. Special interest. Just think about his genealogy. He includes Gentiles in his genealogy. Can anyone say? Who are the Gentiles in Matthew's genealogy?
Rahab.
And? Any other name?
Is it Boaz?
You are closer.
Naomi, right? Naomi, not Naomi. Sorry.
Ruth.
Eh?
Ruth.
Ruth. All right, 2 Gentiles name. He also notes the coming of the Gentile Magi. How do you pronounce? I don't know. Coming of the Gentiles, Magi, to honor the birth of the Jewish Messiah. They were Gentiles. Magi. He specifically mentions that the Gentiles would come to place their hope in the Messiah as well, and they would be included in the kingdom. Interestingly, he's the only one who mentioned the word church in the gospel. Not anyone, because church is where later we'll understand whether you're a Jew or Gentile, you are on a same plane. This is completely different from the covenant community that was there and their style of worship and doing things. So yes, now the structure. I wanted to, people divide various ways. Some people say this has got two structure. I know some people, okay, divide this way: a prologue, chapter 1, verse 1 from 2, chapter 4, verse 11, and then ministry in Galilee, chapter 4, verse 12 to 13, verse 56. Then his itinerary ministry to Jerusalem, that is from 14, verse 1 to 20, verse 34, and his ministry in Jerusalem, right? 21, verses 1 to 28, verse 20. That is the way that some people divide it, structure it. All right. Others would structure differently. They use not much division. They use the word from that time on a phrase to say. So they would say the person of Jesus, the Messiah, first to 4 chapters. Then proclamation of Jesus, the Messiah, 4 to 16. Then suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the Messiah, from 16 to 18. That is another group. All right. But I have given the reason why this from that time on, using that as a formula to divide the books won't help you much. All right. So, okay. What there is others. Let's look at others. Divide. I think that's a little more logical. Divide structuring of this gospel around 5 or 6 major discourses. This approach views opening and closing chapters of the gospel as prologue and epilogue. Maybe that may be an issue, but they divide into 5 or 6 major discourses. The discourses themselves are each preceded by a narrative framework, and 5 of the discourses conclude with the formula, when Jesus had finished. So the outline will be this way, identifying these discourses. You have the prologue, number 1, that is only until chapter 2, verse 23, and that is so first 2 chapters. Then Sermon on the Mount, that actually has a background from chapter 3 until chapter 7. All right. Third, of course, you see the real preaching happens only in chapter 5. We know that, but the background is from the ministry of John and Jesus' baptism, right? That's the background. Then commissioning of the 12, right? Commissioning of the 12, chapter 8, verse 1 to 11 to 1. And then parables of the kingdom, chapter 11, verse 13, 11, verse 2 to 13, verse 52. Then his discourse on humility, offenses, and forgiveness. That's about 13, verse 53 to 8 in verse 35. Then denunciation of the scribes and Pharisees is very important. And then Olivet discourse, and then epilogue, the conclusion. Probably 2 objections to this last approach have been raised. Several have noted that there are no more than the 5 or 6 discourses commonly identified in Matthew's gospel. Chapter 11, for example, contains Jesus' teaching on the John the Baptist. Yet, this chapter is not identified as a major discourses. That was maybe one problem with the above division. Second objection is the outline suggested above relegates the climax of Jesus' earthly ministry, including his passion, resurrection, and to to a sort of secondary status by saying like it is an epilogue. There is a problem in that division. So what our approach is going to take this last, we are going to structure the way that this has been described right here, but avoiding some of the mistakes.